let's come back to the general ledger in a moment, but let's talk about the second book of accounting, and this is called journals. Now, journals, as you'll note by your diagram, has a second name as well. It's called the original book of entry. So we've talked about the final book of entry. Now we're dealing with the original book of entry. The reason why it's called the original book of entry is because that's where we originally start our accounting process. We have journals to enter data into. And we have different types of journals because we have different types of transactions. For instance, the sales journal. What type of transaction do you think is entered into the sales journal? Yeah, it's just a chronological listing of sales invoices. Now let me show you what a sales journal might look like. Here are just another postbinder system with a number of different journals. Okay? And the sales journal, all the journals really look very similar. They just are made up of rows and columns. Okay? Again, it's just a chronological listing, maybe by invoice number, of the different sales we've had during that month. And so sales invoice number 1004 to Bill Anderson is the first one we've listed, 1005, 1006, and so on. In that journal, we record by account what happened to those accounts in the transactions. What was the change to that account? If we got cash, then we're going to record the amount of cash in the column that says cash. Where it came from we'll record where the sale was, how much we sold it for, and so forth. Okay, very simple process. In fact, you don't have to be an accountant to enter data into either a manual or a computer system. Someone just has to show you to take this number and put it here, and this number and put it here. When I was 13, this is what I did. My father took me down and he just showed me, just took him a few minutes. He said, take this number and put it here, and this number and put it here. Now, even at 13, you can do that, okay? So entering transactions into the journals is a bookkeeping function. It's really fairly simple, and with very limited training, you can do it. And we also have, this is sales journal, so it's sales invoices. What do you think goes into the disbursements journal? Cash going out. And how do we usually disperse cash? So it's just a chronological listing of checks. Do you follow that? Okay? And so here's the check numbers, and they're just listed numerically and so forth. It's not much different than what you record right now in your check register when you write a check. A little bit more information that most people don't include in their check register, but it's really fairly simple. Okay? Now notice that there's rows and columns, just like the other journal. When you're entering it into a computer, oftentimes it looks like a check form, and you're just filling in the blanks. How many of you have worked with a accounting computer program before? Okay? Good portion of you. You've probably gone through that process, and it's not difficult to do that, is it? Okay? But what it's doing is it's sucking the information off of that screen, and it's entering it into this format behind the screen. You don't see that, okay? So it's doing exactly the same thing, but it's doing a lot of the work for you. So journals are called the original book of entry because that's where we originally record information into our accounting system. Whenever you enter information into a computer, it's going into a journal. Okay? So recognize that it's there. Sometimes they don't call it that. Sometimes they call it other words, but it's a journal. And that was the term we've used for almost 500 years. It's just the last 10 years that computer software has somewhat changed some of the terminology to fit their own desires. Okay? But it's doing the same thing. Now, each month or each day, depending upon the accounting system we're using, it's transferring the information from the journal into the general ledger. Hence the name, the final book of entry. Everything's flowing into it. It's coming in here by account into the general ledger. Okay? Now just to kind of relate this to something we can all picture. I'm sure all of you have put together one time or another a puzzle. Okay? these 1,000-piece or 2,000-piece puzzles. Has everyone had that experience? I'm looking for this. Okay? Now, what happens is the first thing we do is we spill out all the pieces and we turn them up so that we can see what they are. Okay? What's the next thing that we do after we've got all the pieces spilled out? Yeah, we do the edges, don't we? Don't we all do? You thought you were the only one that did it that way. No, we all pretty well do it that way. We build the edges. Now, why? Why do we do that next? Good, for dimension size. Now, it also gives us points of reference, and some people say, well, it's just a whole lot easier. And all those things are true. But really, dimension and points of reference are the primary reason why we develop the edge pieces first. Okay? Once we've developed the edge, we know the framework, what's the next thing we do?
Match colors.
Okay, so we start to cluster, don't we? By either color or pattern. One person does the silo, another person does the tractor, another person does the fence, right? Okay? Now, why do we do that? Well, it's easier, okay, to try to do that. And we build portions of the picture. And then once we have a cluster built, what do we do with that cluster?
Put it where it's going to be.
Yeah, we try to place it inside that framework where we think it's going to be based on the points of reference, right? And as we bring more and more clusters in, what happens to this picture? It starts taking shape. Now, see, individually, none of those pieces probably really had any value to us. We couldn't even, in most cases, even tell maybe what they were. But when we put them all together in the right place, we have a picture. And that picture is what our whole purpose in getting all those little pieces in there. Now, I don't know if you recognize it. Some of you might, but that's the accounting process, isn't it? In a nutshell. We just put big puzzles together. And we might have 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 pieces, and a piece represents those individual transactions. One check or one deposit really doesn't tell us much about that company's financial position. Our objective as the accountant and bookkeeper is to put all those pieces in the right place so that from it we can develop a picture. And that's what these two books do. The general ledger is our framework. We'll talk about how do we start with the new company. We'll tell you that you build the general ledger first. That's what you always do. And how many general ledgers does every company have? The difference is the size. Okay? The bigger the company, the more elaborate the general ledger. Many companies might have a very, very small general ledger because they're small companies and don't need a lot of detail. The bigger they get, the more detail they request. Okay? So that's the general ledger. Then once we do that, we start clustering these pieces or transactions, right? Where do we do that at? The journals. Why? Because it's easier. It's easy to have one entry point to enter all the sales in. It's easy to have one entry point to enter all the checks in, and so forth. And so we'll enter these in different journals depending upon the transaction. And then, once we've got the cluster built at the end of the month, what do? We transfer them into the general ledger. We build our picture there. Individually, these transactions have no meaning. But once you get them together into the general ledger, you present or you create a picture of the financial position of that business. Now, that's all bookkeeping process, and we're certainly going to understand that throughout the time of this class. And you're going to master that process of doing that. It's really very mechanical, okay? More importantly than that, though, is we're going to spend time talking about how to take that information and utilize it to run the business more effectively, okay? That's where accounting takes over. And that's what we want to emphasize as well in this class.